Welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining today. I'm really excited to share with you some of the work that we've been doing over here at Ninja Theory in conjunction with our partners at Xbox Game Studios to help make accessibility information an absolutely integral aspect of our store product descriptions. But before we go on, just a very quick introduction. It's nice to meet you. My name is Dorian and I'm actually a career video game user interface designer. It's a profession that I've been practicing for over a decade, and I've had an incredible opportunity to work on some really cool titles such as FIFA and FIFA Ultimate Team, Warframe. I've worked within the Gears of War and Dungeons and Dragons franchises. I've worked on Destiny as well, but I'm currently working on Hellblade 2 and Project Mara here at Ninja Theory. However, today I'm not joining you as a UI designer, but I'm actually representing the other role that I hold, which is Ninja Theory's Studio Accessibility Champion. Now, if you're not familiar with Ninja Theory, we're a Cambridge, UK-based studio with over 22 years of history, developing titles such as Kung Fu Chaos, Heavenly Sword, Enslaved: Odyssey to the West, DMC: Devil May Cry, but perhaps most famously, we're the studio behind 2017's Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. And on that note, today we're actually going to be talking more specifically about the 2021 update to Hellblade. It was an enhanced edition that we made in collaboration with a game dev studio called QLock, and we brought significant improvements in two main areas. The first of them was a graphical upgrade. So we wanted to make a version of the game that would really shine on Xbox Series XS, as well as giving our PC players the opportunity to benefit from an enhanced version of the graphics if they had capable hardware to do so. Secondly, and this is where we come in, is that we took advantage of this update, this enhancement, to work in a range of new accessibility options that were not present in the original version of Hellblade. And obviously, we really wanted to showcase these. This was new and exciting and really beneficial to players. So there have been some precedents before in terms of how players are able to determine if they're going to be able to play a game. Notably, Stadia made some really important steps into this space when it came out. But other than that, it's mostly kind of historically been up to players to seek out this information, either from trusted content creators or publications like Can I Play That, to get this kind of critical information that will help them determine whether they can actually play a game or not. So one big thing that happened is in late 2021, however, there were some amazing additions that made their way to the Xbox storefronts. And they came in the form of kind of these fully integrated game accessibility feature tags. And these would essentially see games evaluated against a rubric of predetermined accessibility features. And if the title succeeded in including those accessibility features, they would be awarded with metadata tags which certified them as having these inclusions, and which would in result increase their billing within the accessibility sections of the store. So super awesome addition. So where our story resumes, however, is a tricky situation that we ran into with how titles are handled on the Xbox storefront platforms, where we actually have individual independent storefronts that are hosting either the PC version of the game or on the other side, the console release. Now, in our case on the PC side, it's pretty straightforward. Any PC player who downloads Hellblade gets the enhanced edition. This is the version that includes the graphical upgrades as well as the new accessibility options. However, on the console side, there are actually two versions of Hellblade being served within the exact same store listing: the original version and the enhanced version. Now, as a consumer, this is actually a great experience because with the smart delivery system, you buy the game once and you get both. So what it does is basically detects what hardware you're running on and will serve you the version of the game that corresponds to that. So if you're on Xbox Series XS, you will get served the enhanced version of Hellblade. However, if you're on Xbox One, you'll be served the original version of Hellblade. Now, if you're wondering when in the world all of this has to do with accessibility, this is actually what we're going to look at next. So on the PC storefront, we actually got 11 accessibility feature tags, which is really, really good. However, on the other hand, since the console versions both share a single store listing, we were put in a position where we essentially had to adhere to the lowest common denominator between the two versions, and were thus awarded a single accessibility tag, which corresponds to the amount of accessibility features present in the original version of the game. So although this is not an ideal situation for many reasons, at least we were able to really showcase our entire suite of new features on the PC storefronts. But one realization that we made pretty shortly after completing this exercise was that we actually sell the PC version on a lot more platforms than just the Xbox PC store. In particular, Humble, GOG, and of course Steam. And these storefronts unfortunately don't yet have any sort of accessibility tag system built into their platforms. So essentially we came to the realization, well, how the heck are our players supposed to know what accessibility features are available to them and whether they will play the game or not if they buy our product from anywhere else other than the Xbox storefronts? And we started to think about ways that we could remedy this, and we looked for a way where we could kind of have a platform agnostic method of making accessibility features a really core part of the shopping experience for players, no matter where they buy our games from. So one thing that we realized all of the storefronts have in common is a really nice description section, and it's often called the long description. And we kind of really zeroed in on this section having really high potential to help us solve this user experience problem. And where the rest of this kind of talk is going to go is that we needed to find the best way to approach this. One goal that we really had in mind was coming up with a system that was easily replicable with anyone with a desire to do so, whether they're in Xbox Game Studio or not. So we first needed to figure out how to even categorize our range of accessibility options. And so we're going to look at that first. And just as a kind of a primer on this, everything that will follow is going to be completely derived from the absolutely wonderful and open source accessibility feature tags documentation, which you can find at aka.ms/accessibility gaming metadata. The reason why I mention this is because in terms of this dream of having this be becoming perhaps a standardized system, or at least one that was easily replicable between individuals and titles, having something that was open source was really key in achieving this vision. If it's something that you can't access openly, then that makes it a lot harder for people to adopt. So in terms of these categories that are included in the accessibility feature tags documentation, we're really lucky because they already do a marvelous job at categorization, and they include categories for gameplay, audio, visual, and input. Furthermore, if you've ever worked with the accessibility feature tags before, you know that there's an additional accessibility info rubric, which corresponds to basically whether your game has a URL that people can visit to learn more about the accessibility features. We didn't in our case, but one other thing that we suggest adding as well when you're writing your accessibility features is, including a optional miscellaneous category that could be considered in the event that something just doesn't fit nicely, amongst the big four, if you want to call them that. So to get started, once we figured out what the categories were, we really needed to figure out the best way to write out each individual feature description. And so we actually built directly upon, again, the foundation of the feature tags documentation. If you view the details of any of the rubrics, you'll see something like this. So custom volume controls, fantastic. That's a great start. However, one thing that we found was in terms of the player really understanding what they were getting from a feature, just having custom volume controls wasn't necessarily enough to really know if it was going to meet their needs or not. So the approach that we took was to essentially take this foundation, using the key wording of the feature tag itself, and then naturally concatenating that further level of detail that would really benefit the player. So in our case, custom volume controls can be adjusted for master, music, sound effects, voices, and menu audio. And that really helps a lot in kind of understanding the extent of the feature that we're offering. And we repeated this process with our other features compared to their relevant tags. For example, game can be paused. Cool. But how about game can be paused both during gameplay and cinematics? It gives a way better indication of what's available. So basically, we ended up with this core structure that consists of the accessibility tag keyword plus the exact details that pertain to it in the context of the game itself. Let's look at a couple more examples. So, full keyboard support, allowing the game to be entirely played with keyboard. Arrow keys replace mouse and right stick movement, also taking the time to mention those little caveats so that the player really understands what is being offered. Adjustable input sensitivity for controller, joystick, and mouse axes, and the ability to invert the camera axes. So we're starting to get the hang of it by now on how to process these, generally speaking. However, one really major question that we faced in our process was, what happens if we have a feature in our game that is not part of the accessibility feature tag rubrics? And we had a little bit of debate over whether to include these or not, but we really overwhelmingly found that the benefits to the players so drastically outweighed any sense of perfect alignment with the tag rubrics. So in our case, this really manifested for our mono sound feature, which has no feature tag in the accessibility feature tag documentation. But lucky for us, by now we are quite familiar with the standard formatting that these go through, to the point where we can actually make our own that really follows suit with the rest. So in our case, audio output can be adjusted between stereo and mono sound modes. Sweet. So we can now repeat this process and our basis will be covered for really any scenario. So one thing that we want to look at as well is, some special considerations that we had to make in regards to how we refer to things within these accessibility feature descriptions. In particular, one thing that you're going to come across a lot is, how do I refer to player-facing values which they would see within the game? It's going to come up in every single one. And we opted for name capitalization to really clearly call these out so that when reading our descriptions, the player is then able to immediately know what value can be adjusted in the game itself. So in our case, in the case of subtitle background types, subtitle backgrounds can be adjusted between transparent or solid black. Now there's another really, really juicy subject to tackle, and that's how to best represent any sort of nomenclature which could potentially be seen as subjective. And perhaps there's no better example of this than how we name difficulties. Easy, normal, hard. And in a lot of ways, with what we know about accessibility and difficulty and everyone having different thresholds, who are we to say what is normal or what is hard? Right? It changes for everyone. So to handle the representation of this sort of terminology, we actually opted to always contain these terms within inverted commas or single quotes, if you want to call them that. So in practice, that looks something like this. So adjustable combat difficulty between dynamically adjusted auto mode or manually selected easy, medium, or hard modes. And it makes it really, really clear that, hey, these are subjective terms that we've used. Another great example of this sort of terminology would be something like font sizing, where if you think about it, terms like standard and large, they don't correspond to any universally understood metrics of font sizing. So it makes sense to treat those names very similarly to this. Now, obviously, it could be argued that the best option would be to address this sort of terminology directly in the game itself, but as you might know, it's often not as easy said as done. So this is a great method to have in the case where you're not able to adjust those in the game itself. So the very last part of what we're going to talk about today is just give you a quick overview of kind of what the road to publication looks like. From the first step of you wanting to do this all the way to you actually publishing it on your storefronts, this is what it'll look like. So it is an 8-step process. And the first one is just going to be to really, if you are in a position where you're either already published or are about to publish and you've received the listing of feature tags that are applicable to your title, start with those, note those down. If you're not quite there yet, it's going to be really helpful to get ready for it by simply cross-checking with the accessibility feature tags documentation against your feature set and see which ones you think that you will succeed in. Once that's done, it's really important to perform an overall audit of your title to look for any accessibility features that are not part of the feature tags and to make note of those as well. And then step 3 really just involves bringing them both together and creating your write-up according to the formatting rules that we talked about today already. Then is going to become a bit of a validation trifecta of steps. So the first is going to be to want to validate this with people who will essentially be able to verify whether the claims that you're making are true or not. In our case, we reached out to our Xbox accessibility team as well as Studio Quality to give them a chance to weigh in on what and also how we were reporting the features that we were going to showcase in this regard. After that, there's likely going to be someone in your organization, and this is going to change from company to company, but you're going to have somebody who is typically responsible for actually publishing the store descriptions on your storefronts. In our case, we have a release management team, but this is basically going to be a case of just giving this person a heads up that, hey, we want to do this. It's been validated, just a heads up that this is potentially coming down the pipe. The last step of validation is going to be kind of getting your green light from the upper level stakeholders if they were not a part of the previous groups. In your case, this could be a studio director or a marketing director, that sort of thing. The reason for doing this is because the storefront is a pretty high stakes facet of your product, so it's always good to perform due diligence here and to get buy-in, especially before the next stage, which is localization. Now, one of the great advantages of this entire system is how cheap it is. You can do this all yourself. You can write the descriptions yourself. You don't need anyone to support you in this. But at the localization stage is where the cost is going to come, and it's really the only cost of the entire process. And why it's needed is because it's very likely that you have your store product page in other languages than English or the one that is your native tongue or that you wrote it in. So it's going to be really important so that people with accessibility needs from other cultures can also benefit from getting this. So Finally, you're going to publish, and that's pretty much the end of it. And yeah, I really invite you from this point to, consider making this small investment in your titles. It's a really simple, it's a really economical solution to a barrier that, many of our players have faced for a really long time. And, with this gesture, hopefully we can further our mission of making gaming for everyone. Thank you so much. If you want to take this offline, feel free to reach to me on Twitter. I'd love to talk more or see you in chat as well. So thank you so much for joining today. Bye.